department undertook to develop the sustainable wildlife economy standards and the wildlife certification scheme, which essentially emanates from the biodiversity economy strategy and the biodiversity economy lab. So the project is funded by Noktula right there, DFFE UNDP under BioFin, and Lindi here is our consultant appointed to pilot the scheme. So mine will be very quick because I need to leave more time for Lindi, who will be taking us through the pilot phase and also indicate the next step in terms of how we're going to operationalize the scheme going forward. So as a way of introduction. So the purpose of the Sustainable Wildlife Economy Standards and the Wildlife Certification Scheme is that it seeks to encourage sustainable land management practices in the wildlife sector, increase the wildlife-based land users' contribution to biodiversity and biodiversity conservation and species and landscape at species and landscape level, and also provide a transparent and systematic means of data and information coalition to advocate for and showcase the industry impact, especially in terms of the contribution to conservation and community empowerment, but also it seeks to stimulate inclusive growth and development in the sector and support favorable reputation locally and internationally. I think also Deborah there spoke at length in terms of the purpose of and its relevancy to the economy. So how the scheme will work is that we have registered a non-profit company that will be responsible for running with the scheme and will be the owner of the sustainable standards. So basically the standards is voluntary and market-led. As government, we won't have any intervention or role to play in the scheme. Once we are done with the setting up the scheme, we'll then hand it over to the industry to operationalize it. And also the scheme, how we've designed it is that it recognizes continuous improvement. So basically there's three levels of affiliation. The first level is aware, where at a game range level, the owner will be able to assess themselves annually in terms of whether they do comply with the sustainability standards that I'm going to share in my next slide. And the second stage is progressive, where the certification scheme, which we have named it the Sustainable Wildlife Economy Council, will then review whether the game ranch is compliant with the standards. And the third level is integrative. This is where now the rancher will then be assessed by a recognized certification body such as your EcoSafe or Control Union. So how the scheme, how are we going to ensure the sustainability of the scheme? So as I've mentioned that this will be run or operated by the industry, then the industry actors will then have to contribute for them to be members of this scheme. And in terms of now the incentives, the department, we are currently trying to identify what incentives will be provided for those game ranches that will be compliant with the scheme. But I think it's worth to mention that when we were consulting during the development of the scheme, these are the benefits or incentives that the game ranchers indicated that they would want to accrue from affiliating with the scheme. And some of it relates to TOPS exemption, just to name a few. And in terms of now the outcome, what we desire as an outcome for this scheme is that the scheme it's not legislation, but it will complement the existing legislation. Then it will also differentiate a ranch or a farm or a product, and also provide assurance to consumers and enhance resilience and added value. Okay. So as I've mentioned that there is the standard, I think Mrs. Deborah here outlined it very clear that there is a standard, then there's the owner of the standard. So in our case, the owner of the standard is the Sustainable Wildlife Economy Council, which is essentially the certification scheme. So this is the sustainability standard that we used in our pilot phase. So it consists of 3 pillars, which is on the land, which is basically focusing on the business operation, and there is an aspect, a pillar on the land. Then it focuses on the species management and the land management aspect, and the last part of it is the product, which focuses on whether, you know, if you produce, if game meat is your end product, or you're compliant throughout the value chain. And in each pillar, there are some criterias that the game ranchers are measured on. So this is the first part of the presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Lindi, who's going to take us through the pilot phase. Thank you.
You're praised to move on next. Hi, good afternoon all. Thank you to the African Wildlife Economy Institute and the DFFE and UNDP for this opportunity to present the results of the pilot study. So in line with the terms of reference, the UNDP's terms of reference for the pilot study entailed a sample of 20 game farms in South Africa, and it was required that at least 4 of the sites be previously disadvantaged individuals or community property associations, and 4 were to be female owned. So on the table, you'll see that the total female owned that were 100% were 4. The others were either 25% or 50%, and then the previously disadvantaged individuals and the community protected areas, these amounted to 8. Okay, so the reason for this was it was premised on having a stratified and representative sample, which is beneficial for data collection as it gathers diverse range of perceptions from different socioeconomic backgrounds, farming scales, and geographies. Okay, and this also derives significance from intersecting heterogeneous data sources. Okay, so just to look at the distribution of the pilot sites, the selection of the pilot sites was based on the overall density of game farms in South Africa, of which Limpopo had the highest. So there were 9 farms in Limpopo, and this was followed by the Eastern Cape, where there were 3 sites, and the rest were KwaZulu-Natal, and the border between KwaZulu-Natal and, the border between Northern Cape and Free State and Northern Cape Northwest, and there was one between Gauteng and Northwest that also bordered. Okay, the fieldwork was undertaken intermittently over a period of 3 months. So this is in the 3rd quarter of 2024 from July to September. This was interprovincially. Okay, also noteworthy was the fact that the audit took place in accordance with certification requirements, which is during peak season. So peak season is harvesting, production, processing. So in the context of wildlife ranching and game farming in South Africa, this period aligned with hunting. So it was favorable to be able to pilot the study in peak season. Okay. So the sampling approach was both voluntary by game ranchers who willingly came forward to participate in the study, as well as purposive by deliberately selecting suitable game ranchers who would aid in meeting the objectives put forth in the terms of reference of the study. The prospective sites were also guided by the UNDP and the DFFE and SANBI and members of the interim board so that I could have a good selection. Okay. So just to take you through the data analysis. So the pilot assignment included both qualitative and quantitative methods. So the qualitative portion include key informant interviews and an online self-assessment questionnaire. And it was using the standard, this is Sustainable Wildlife Economy Standard, as the memorandum. And the main technique employed to encode the responses was memoing and using the SWES as the memorandum. Okay, and this was also against the three CI levels, the continuous improvement levels, as mentioned by Tseleng, which is aware, progressive, and integrative. Okay, then the responses were then, the coded responses were then analyzed quantitatively according to a weighted score. So this is represented in the following slide, whereby the second pillar held more gravity than the first. So the sustainable land management and species weight had a higher weight than the general pillar. Okay, so I think I've discussed sampling already, that it was undertaken intermittently, but just also to note that, that included the self-assessment questionnaire. The ethical considerations, the game ranchers volunteered or were contacted and then agreed to participate in the pilot study. So instead of ordinarily raising findings as you would in an audit, they were rather assessed in terms of their correlation to the standard. The respondents were asked to acknowledge and undersign a disclaimer in accordance with the Protection of Personal Income Act, Information Act, and this is to ensure that the information shared, including contact details, photographs, would be anonymized and not distributed, but rather served for the purpose of the pilot study. The same was included for the online questionnaire. Okay, so based on the continuous improvement levels of the standard, so as we mentioned, it is aware, progressive, and integrative. So those who scored between 0 and 65%, they were placed on the aware level, and above 65, between 65 and 80, they were progressive, and 80 and above were integrative. So the on-site audit results, we had a total of 8 who were integrative, 6 who were progressive, and 6 who were aware. So this is how closely they correlated to the standard. Then on the online questionnaire side, we had a total of 4 who correlated to the integrated level, and 6 who were on progressive, and then 4 who were on aware. Okay. So the next steps for the certification scheme. So now that the standard has been drafted, it's in its first version. This happened between 2022 and 2023. And now I've piloted the standard by means of an audit in 2024. I've also reviewed it and found that it needs to undergo revision, which would happen in the preparation phase of 2025 and leading up to 2026. So upon review of the standard, there were 2 points that were brought to the fore for revision. The first one was the model of the standard. So they employed a continuous improvement model, and this is without a baseline, having a first standard. And I found that this to be quite vacillating in that some elements that were in aware were also applicable in progressive, and it was hard to make a defined answer. Just as what Deborah said, you kind of have to know the standard needs to be defined and needs to be resolute, but it was vacillating in some points between aware, progressive, and integrative. So for me, I think that this needs to be revised in terms of the model. And then also the metric of the standard. So your standard normally requires a monitoring tool if you're going to employ continuous improvement levels, because this is how you measure your increments of improvement. And the standard didn't have this, or doesn't have the monitoring and measuring mechanism. And I used this against ISO 14001 and Rainforest Alliance and CESA, of which I'm all trained in. And all of three employ a sort of monitoring and measuring to see how you progress over time. So I thought that these two would be the main points to include in the revision in the preparation phase. So upon revision, which I assume would happen in the first quarter of 2025, it would then require the standard to be operationalized. So the UNDP are the copyright holders, so they hold the intellectual property of the standard, and then it would need to be operationalized by a nonprofit organization as such. And then it would be fit for publication through a third-party certification body, and the game farmers or game ranchers who would want to be certified to the standard would also require training in the standard. Okay, and yes, so if the site is applying for certification, their first year of certification would be 2026, and that would mark year 1 of certification, and thereafter the standard would keep revising. So yeah, that is all for me. Thank you.